Classical Greek and Roman antiquity has been repeatedly reimagined over the century in a very wide and diverse variety of ways. It would take a whole course in itself to study the complexities of how Rome and Greece have been remembered and re-represented and used in a variety of different ways and different media. I'd like to take a very specific case study of film, cinema, in the 20th century specifically. Now, the reasons for doing this is firstly to provide a clear and specific, a manageable case study where we can look at some of the different ways, maybe some of the ways that are also recurrent at other periods and in other media, that antiquity has been represented and the meanings that it's had for more contemporary audiences. But also, I think, because 20th century film had such a significant impact on how classical Greek and Roman antiquity were viewed in the Western world specifically, that's really still with us now in the 21st century and in a variety of ways that we see Greece and Rome depicted and thought about indeed. A lot of the baggage of these previous imaginings of the ancient world is still with us, I think, when we view classical antiquity. And from the earliest days of cinema, ancient Greece and in particular ancient Rome were very prominent settings for feature films of one type or another. There are several reasons for this, one of which is a previous tradition in other genres such as theatre, opera in particular, in novels and so on, of investigating, of exploring ancient themes and ancient settings, which film in the early days adopts as its filmmakers are looking around for models for their creations. But there are some other reasons, I think, why the ancient world appealed to early filmmakers. And these reasons are indicative of how the ancient world is being imagined at the time, and are also features which persist in the depiction of the ancient world on film throughout the 20th century and beyond. In particular, from very early on, the ancient world is used as a vehicle for spectacle. One of the clearest examples of this, although there are several from the first decades of feature films, is one of the earliest renditions of The Last Days of Pompeii on film, based of course on a 19th century novel about the last days of Pompeii. But this film, which is an Italian production, as many of these early representations in cinema of the ancient world were, clearly chooses this subject matter in order to display cinema's ability to provide spectacle. And as you can see from this clip, to our eyes today, a lot of this spectacle is cheesy, of course. We're looking at effectively special effects from the first decades of the 20th century, but for a filmic audience, seeing the original depiction at that time, this is a form of spectacle that they could seldom access. The alignment of thinking about the ancient world as a place of big spectacle, whether it's, as in this case, eruption of volcanoes, or it's chariot races or gladiatorial games or large-scale battles of ancient armies, determines to a large extent the sorts of ways in which the ancient world is depicted, the sorts of stories that are told on the screen about the ancient world time and again. But spectacle, or the opportunity to explore large-scale spectacle through ancient settings and ancient stories, is not the only predominant theme that we see early on in filmic depictions of the ancient world. From very early on, there's a close relationship between a setting in ancient Greece, or in particular ancient Rome, and a deep moralism. Now, this moralism relates somewhat to the early contexts of film and the cinema industry and its development, where there were a number of concerns, moral concerns in essence, about the impact of this new medium, the sort of moral concerns perhaps we're familiar with on repeated occasions throughout the rest of the 20th century as new media such as television, and then of course the internet or video games or whatever it might be come online. There are typically a number of sections of society and points of view which have some moral concerns about it, and cinema in the early decades of the 20th century certainly faced those sorts of concerns. So the investing of stories on film with a moral, with a clear representation of moral purpose and moral rectitude is a way potentially of countering those claims that cinema and the attendance at cinema and watching these films might be detrimental to moral character. And ancient stories are used to convey a moral in this way. One of the most obvious examples of this, and one that of course is used subsequent to the early decades of the 20th century on many occasions, is the story of Nero, and particularly the downfall of the Emperor Nero. Nero already, of course, in ancient sources after his reign, is represented in a broadly negative way, viewed as effectively a bad emperor, as a tyrant, and often represented as, in effect, mad or out of control. And the stories that are told in later centuries about Nero obviously developed this even further. So by the first decades of the 20th century, film can draw on a figure such as Nero in order to represent the fate of a morally bad character, but also, and there is potentially a political aspect to this, a bad ruler. A good early example of this is the 1909 film, again an Italian production directed by Luigi Maggi, of Nero or the Burning of Rome, which shows not simply Nero's crimes, so to speak, but his ultimate downfall, his ultimate destruction and death, representing that as the consequences for his, really in the context of this film, evil actions. But at the same time as this can be seen as a reasonably straightforward moral representation of the ancient world, or use of the ancient world and ancient stories in order to convey moral messages, it is of course allowing filmmakers to depict the morally bad, the crimes, the debauchery of the figures such as Nero who are being depicted, because of course that will ultimately in the story be punished. But in the process, the audience is able to see stylized, admittedly, but versions of Nero's crimes, the murders, the orgies, and so on. And this is another aspect of early depictions of the ancient world, which is interesting to a number of scholars of early cinema, and is not unique, certainly, to depictions of the ancient world in early cinema, but I think the ancient world provides, or is seen to provide, a very productive canvas for filmmakers to develop this. And this is a clear eroticism that is invested in representations of, again, predominantly ancient Rome, but also on rare occasions ancient Greece as well. And so the motif of decadent Rome, which of course is already there in not simply some of the historical writings about Rome in previous centuries, but also a lot of the novelistic and the dramatic on the stage depictions of the ancient world, particularly in the 19th century, but even before then, becomes again another staple of representations of the ancient world on film, because of this alignment with elements of eroticization, perhaps titillation of the audience, and the moral meanings that are invested in representations of the ancient world. Now, while spectacle, moralism, and perhaps also eroticization are key elements of early representations of the ancient world in cinema, there's another important thread running through these early depictions, which I've already alluded to. There's a political, or perhaps a better term for it would be an ideological aspect to this, which owes a great deal to previous traditions, but in particular, and you would have noticed that a number of these early feature-length productions about the ancient world on film come from Italy, owes a great deal to the very specific historical and social contexts out of which these films are being produced. In Italy in particular, models of understanding ancient Rome had been very closely associated with nationalism and the eventual unification of Italy as a nation in the movement known as the Risorgimento, or the Resurgence, in roughly 1820 to 1870. The concept of Romanità, of Romanness, was core to the formation of an identity which eventually becomes associated and aligned, as I say, with the national Italian identity. It was used as a way of bringing the disparate Italian states and sub-states of the period together in a single political unit. And of course, there are a number of key figures who used these concepts of Romanità to forward the movement, most famously Giuseppe Garibaldi, of course, but this is a perhaps more widespread matter than simply Italian nationalism. You can see similar uses of concepts of Romanness in state formation and nationalism from even an earlier period. It's very closely, or it's very important at least, as well, of course, for the formation of the United States and national identity in that context at the end of the 18th and the early 19th century. There is perhaps a somewhat dark side to this, and certainly something that will develop in somewhat dark ways later in the 20th century, in an association of Romanità, of course, with Roman Empire. Romanness and empire, or Romanness and imperialism, very closely linked, of course, because of the Roman Empire itself, its breadth and its extent. And so in Italy, for instance, the nationalist movement that leads to the unification of Italy also has an element within it which sees Italy as destined, as almost requiring an empire in order to follow the model of Rome, to really achieve that Romanità, that Romanness. And indeed, early in the 20th century, around the same times that these early cinematic depictions of the ancient world and ancient Rome in particular are starting to appear, produced from Italy, Italy is starting to expand in an imperialistic way, most significantly in the conquest of Libya in 1911. And some of the films that come out around that time, or slightly after that, can easily be seen as representing, ideologically supporting that sort of movement towards imperialism and growth. The best known example of this, still cited to this day as a example of an ideological film, is the 1914 production of Cabiria. Now, I won't go into the details of the actual plot of Cabiria because it is very involved and complex, and there are elements here of what we today would call melodrama, which are common in many of these early cinematic stories. But in essence, Cabiria explores the Roman conflict with Carthage, and the Punic Wars, as we would refer to them, and the eventual conquest of Carthage by the Romans in fairly black and white terms, and that's not simply a pun about this being a black and white silent film. The Romans are very, very clearly represented as the righteous conquerors, and the Carthaginians as the disreputable, almost evil, certainly debauched civilization that must be conquered and reformed or destroyed by the imperial Romans. And this ideological use of Roman antiquity in particular is very revealing, not simply because this is something that continues, albeit in quite different forms, later on in the 20th century in cinematic depictions of the ancient world. But of course, in that precise time period, we can see how these ways of thinking about ancient Rome and representing ancient Rome are coalescing around certain political perspectives and certain political movements that will eventually lead to the first European fascist regime under Benito Mussolini, established in 1922. And European fascism, certainly without doubt, puts right at the forefront supposed links, supposed continuity and legacy with the ancient world, and Rome in particular, interpreted in a very specific way, or very specific emphases in terms of how the ancient world and the ancient Roman world is understood. That emphasis, as I've said, on imperialism and the imperial drive and conquest, the connection of ethnicity or blood with the land that fascism establishes, also makes some claims to have roots in Roman antiquity, very contestable, very debatable roots, of course, in Roman antiquity, and the use of classical antiquity and Roman antiquity in particular to further fascist ideas as an ideological tool is very prominent in these decades, and we can see it clearly in cinema as we can in many other forms and many other media at this time. Now, if we move into the period following the Second World War, we still see that classical antiquity is being invested on the screen in cinema with a variety of different ideological meanings. Although, of course, naturally given the dramatic changes that take place in the middle of the 20th century, in rather different ways than we see in the earlier decades of that century. Now, if Italy was one of, if not the major producer of cinematic depictions of the ancient world in the early decades of the 20th century, at a time when Italy had a very significant film industry with a global impact in the era of silent films. In the years and the decades that immediately follow the Second World War, clearly the US and specifically the Hollywood film industry takes over that mantle. And for a large number of film critics, the 50s and the 60s are often viewed as the golden age of the representation of big-scale epics, epic films as a whole, but in particular epic films about the ancient world. And as with earlier films, we can see a number of particular qualities that persist or recur throughout the representation of antiquity in these films, some of which have a very, very strong and direct relationship with those earlier aspects of spectacle and moralism and even eroticism, and certainly with the use of antiquity as an ideological vehicle for a variety of different socio-political ideas. The element of spectacle, for instance, certainly returns or persists, continues in the Hollywood epic representations of antiquity from the 50s and 60s, but in an interesting way which actually serves to foreground, to emphasise the excess and the expense that is being invested in these big budget films. Famously, many of the films about the ancient world from the 50s and particularly from the 60s were the most costly productions of their age. The best known example of this is perhaps also one of the last, which is the Joseph Mankiewicz production from 1963 of Cleopatra, which sometimes erroneously is said to have bankrupted the the production company and so on. But in all of these films, the expense is not simply a matter of budget hidden away. It's there on the screen to see. Efforts are being made to demonstrate opulence, and antiquity is being used as a site of opulence to foreground that. Not simply the costumes and the scene setting, but the number of extras, the crowds, and all of this is frequently referred to in the publicity for the films. That this is the most expensive production, that there were hundreds of thousands of extras, that it's dripping with gold and pricey costumes and so on. This is seen as part of the attraction for the audience of coming to see a spectacle, an epic about the ancient world. And so you have this very close association of antiquity with expense and with excess. Now, in the context of the post-Second World War period, particularly in the US, and thinking of the 50s and early 60s specifically, that are typically seen as an economic boom time, there is obviously a close association of this expense and excess being seen on screen with consumerism and economic buoyancy and the celebration of that to some extent. It's interesting that alongside all these films, of course, something that we perhaps think of as a later development with the promotion of cinema, merchandising is extremely common. So not only could audiences go along and see this excess and this wealth and this expense and so on, but they could literally buy into it. They could purchase the goods, they could wear facsimiles of the clothes, they could get makeup that echoes the makeup of Elizabeth Taylor in Cleopatra and so on. But as with the spectacle elements of very early cinematic representations of the ancient world, this expense and this excess is framed within a moral or more correctly perhaps an ideological framework that serves to make it more than simply enjoyment of excess and consumerism for its own sake. In particular, a large number of the films focus on the representation of Roman tyranny. Films such as The Robe of 1953 or Quo Vadis of 1951, but also into the 60s as well with the epic production of The Fall of the Roman Empire in 1964, one of the last of this stream of 50s and 60s epics about the ancient world. There's a focus on the rulers of Rome and rulership, emperors, and the typically negative ways in which the political systems at Rome work, and the tendency for individual tyrants to take over and to cause their communities great distress and destruction. Now, this can be clearly related to the experience and the way in which the experience of the previous decade or so were understood in those post-Second World War years. That many of the representations of Roman tyranny in these films of the 50s and 60s clearly owe a great deal to the way in which the Allies represented their enemies during the Second World War, fascism in particular, and there's, because of that shared alignment between many of the fascist regimes in Italy and as well in Germany and antiquity, their supposed modelling on Roman Empire in particular. There's a fair deal of shared iconography too that would serve for an audience in the 50s to very directly link the representation of Roman tyranny with more recent experiences of fascist regimes. The most obvious one is the fasces themselves, the bundles of rods bundled around the axe, which was a representation of the magisterial status of Roman officials, which the fascist regimes adopt in their own iconography, and of course the Italian fascist movement is named after the Fasces and that representation of official Roman imperialist ideals. But there's another aspect here as well, which is brewing away in the 50s and 60s, which of course, whilst it is post-Second World War, is also the period of the height of the Cold War. And the ways in which ideologically the conflict between Western democracies, and particularly in the context of these Hollywood epics, we're discussing US democracy and Soviet communist regimes, and in the period of the early 50s, of course, the period from which Quo Vadis in 51 comes, for instance, in particular Stalinist, the Stalinist regime in Russia, is also coming to the forefront. Potentially there is an evocation of the ways in which that conflict was being ideologically represented at the time, in how Rome is represented as well. One example of how these elements can come together in sometimes very, very explicit ways comes from the prologue, the spoken prologue, to the 1951 version of Quo Vadis.
This is the Appian Way, the most famous road that leads to Rome, as all roads lead to Rome. On this road march her conquering legions. Imperial Rome is the center of the empire, an undisputed master of the world. But with this power, inevitably comes corruption. No man is sure of his life. The individual is at the mercy of the state. Murder replaces justice. Rulers of conquered nations surrender their helpless subjects to bondage. High and low alike become Roman slaves, Roman hostages. There is no escape from the whip and the sword. That any force on earth can shake the foundations of this pyramid of power and corruption, of human misery and slavery, seems inconceivable. But 30 years before this day, a miracle occurred. On a Roman cross in Judea, a man died to make men free, to spread the gospel of love and redemption. Soon that humble cross is destined to replace the proud eagles that now top the victorious Roman standards. This is the story of that immortal conflict. In this, the early summer in the year 64 AD, in the reign of the Antichrist known to history as the Emperor Nero, the victorious 14th Legion is on its way back to Rome, under the command of one Marcus Vinicius.
Here you have Rome defined as a tyranny, ruled by a figure who is very explicitly referred to as an antichrist. Similar sorts of language that was used, in fact, both at the time, both of the fascist regimes and the leaders of the fascist regimes in the 40s, and of the leaders of the Soviet regime during the period of the Cold War. But it draws attention to another aspect here of how the representation of Rome is presented in opposition to Christianity. And this is something that scholars of film sometimes refer to as almost a subgenre within the representation of the ancient world on film, the so-called Roman Christian film. Perhaps the best known examples, in fact one that was fairly recently remade, is Ben-Hur. The production of 1959 is probably the most significant one, but there were a number of other films in this genre as well. The Robe of 53 can be seen as a Roman Christian film that opposes Roman tyranny to nascent early Christianity. Similarly, Barabbas of 1962, probably the latest of this subgenre of Roman Christian films. And in that, Roman tyranny is very clearly being opposed to Christian freedom. And whilst in several of these films, by the end of the film itself, Rome and Roman tyranny might indeed actually seem to be triumphant, the representation of eventual victory for Christianity for freedom down the track is clear to all members of the audience and flagged in various ways in the films themselves. And this is not, as I say, this is not, I think, simply reflecting a religious ideology, although it is doing that as well, but reflecting on other ways in which conflicts between tyranny and freedom are being understood ideologically during the period of the 50s and the 60s. But there's one last element which I wanted to emphasise about how the ancient world is represented in these big blockbuster epics of the 50s and 60s, these Hollywood epics about the ancient world, because it is very prominent and it is still with us in how we think about the ancient world. Perhaps one of the first things we think about the ancient world, and certainly what we choose to depict of classical antiquity on screen on those occasions where you still do have films that represent the ancient world. Ancient Greece and Rome, both in this case, very much represented as periods of extreme violence. Not simply violence, but extreme violence. This relates, of course, to this element of spectacle in the way that the ancient world is understood and represented in this genre, because very often those spectacles are precisely spectacles of violence and even cruelty, the predominance of scenes in the arena, for instance, or the predominance of extremely violent battle scenes demonstrate that, for example. Returning to conclude to that period of the 50s and 60s, there are some films that perhaps investigate this element of a hyper-violent association with antiquity in a somewhat more complex way. One of the interesting ones would be the production of Spartacus from 1960, the Stanley Kubrick version of Spartacus. In that film, which is certainly in its own way foregrounding violence and representing the ancient Roman context as a hyper violent and cruel one, which is also drawing upon these ideas of association of Rome with tyranny and this contrast, this opposition of tyranny and freedom that these films often try to explore, is also exploring the way in which the violence is deployed through a very, very well-oiled and efficient military machine, and perhaps in some ways in a more nuanced way reflecting upon the sources and the causes and the institutionalization of violence through the use of the ancient Roman setting and the ancient Roman story and the model that is already there, as I've said, in a variety of different ways in earlier and contemporary films about the ancient world. while the 50s and 60s can be seen as the heyday of the Hollywood version of epic antiquity, there are other subgenres of cinema which are representing or are drawing upon stories about antiquity in somewhat different ways to emphasise some other aspects or to understand and approach the ancient material in different ways. One interesting example is, again, a largely Italian subgenre, although often these are co-productions that involve Italian settings and Italian production companies, but American actors or actors from elsewhere, which is a subgenre sometimes referred to today as the peplum film, because of the costume that, in particular, the male lead often wears, this short tunic, which is referred to, a form of ancient dress referred to as the peplum, although the version of it worn by the actors in the film differs, of course, in a variety of ways from the actual ancient costume itself. Now, the peplum film is perhaps most obviously characterised by its lead male character, Hercules, or Meciste. Hercules, obviously the better known one now, but there are a number of these figures. Some, like Hercules, drawn from classical mythology, other, like Meciste, are fictional, but in all cases represented as very buff, very strong, very physically active male figures. Male figures indeed that throughout the film, and they're not the only characters to do this, but throughout the film are putting their physicality on display and their bodies on display. And this perhaps relates somewhat to the very early, very persistent use of ancient contexts in order to develop an eroticism and put the body on display in a variety of ways. Interesting in this case that it's not only the male body at all. This is true of the female characters in the films as well, but the central depiction of the male figure emphasises the male body on display. Now, to some extent, you could say this is true in the Hollywood epics as well, and I do encourage you to have a look at some of those that I've mentioned, and maybe some others on the filmography that we'll provide as well, and watch out for these elements of display and eroticisation. It's just perhaps a little bit more explicit in the peplum films, for instance, to the point where often you have a clearly objectified spectacle of the male body in action, as you can see from this discus scene from one of the very early 1950s films about Hercules, starring Steve Reeves.
No one in all of Thessaly has ever beaten me in throwing the discus. Do you accept the challenge?
Certainly.
If Thetis had chosen wisely, the heavy build of Hercules will be a point against him in this trial of skill.
Let's wait and see.
A throw of 137 feet.
That was an unusually long throw.
It will be difficult for Hercules to beat that record.
Don't be too sure.
Right, Hercules, show us your style. How do you throw the discus in Thebes? With 2 hands?
He must truly be the son of Jupiter.
Get out of my way! Get out of my way!
So in scenes like this, on the one hand, you have arguably the body objectified. You also have a very particular representation of masculinity, and masculinity expressed through action, through conflict, through violence, through that violence that is commonly associated with antiquity, of course. There are elements in these films as well which can be interpreted ideologically and can be seen maybe as reflecting some ideological structures and debates of the period. Now, I wouldn't want to leave this case study of the ancient world on 20th century film by just focusing on the serious, ideological, spectacle-driven, hyper-violent elements of either the Hollywood epic or early Italian depictions of the ancient world and suggest that that's all there was. There is in fact another very interesting strand of the representation of the ancient world that is effectively using the ancient world for comedy, playing it for laughs, and in fact the ancient world becomes a feature in some musical comedies as well in interesting ways. Now, in large part, these comic representations of antiquity can be seen as referring to, bouncing off, on some occasions flat out satirising the more serious epic depictions of antiquity, or the moralising depictions of antiquity that I've already discussed. The clear and the most obvious example of this, of course, the most direct example of this, is the 1965 production of Carry On Cleo from the Carry On series, a number of films in that series, but this one in particular is directly a response to the 1964 Mankiewicz production of Cleopatra and all its excess and so on, and satirises that, has fun with that, picks out the cliches, some of which I've mentioned around the way in which antiquity is understood, and turn those on its head and plays it for fun. And there are some elements here too that oddly evoke some aspects of Roman comedy that we've seen. To what extent that's a conscious thing or not in these cases is entirely debatable, but certainly, as with Roman comedy, can take some elements of ancient institutions which we would see as themselves particularly serious and in some cases oppressive, such as slavery, and turn them on their head as well. For example, a film of 1933, Roman Scandals, starring the great vaudevillian actor and big movie star at the time, Eddie Cantor, plays on the idea of slavery, and to some extent has some associations with the clever slave figure. Essentially, in a nutshell, the plot involves an unemployed man of the Depression era in America being magically transported back to Roman times in order to survive masquerading as a slave, and through masquerading as a slave finding himself in a lot of situations that are comic, also to some extent desirable. And I'll show you one example, actually a very famous musical number from Roman Scandals, which demonstrates this and also shows, incidentally, some of the opulence that was being associated with the ancient world, even in films such as this, where it's being played for laughs. I should warn you, of course, that this film is drawing upon conventions of its own period, which we today would see as very revealing of how ancient slavery is being aligned, consciously or unconsciously, with more recent experiences, particularly in the US, of slavery and oppression, although here, of course, as I say, being played for laughs.
Well, all I can tell you is athletics, cosmetics, a weighing machine are part of the feminine daily routine for what? And oceans of lotions and potions you take to keep that old something or other awake, why not? Even after you grow old, baby, you don't have to be a cold baby. Keep young and beautiful. It's your duty to be beautiful. Keep young and beautiful. If you wanna be loved, da-da-da-da, don't fail to do your stuff with a little powder and a puff. Keep young and beautiful if you wanna be loved. If you're wise, exercise all the fat off. Take it off of here, over there. When you're seen anywhere with your hat off, have a permanent wave in your hair. Take care of all those charms, and you'll always be in someone's arms. Keep young and beautiful if you wanna be loved.
I think the particular articulation of ancient slavery here, and specifically that it's being played for fun, it's being played for laughs, can actually be quite confronting and disturbing in retrospect, although very revealing, and kind of the point I'm trying to make here is very revealing of the ways in which antiquity is being imagined at that particular time in the 1930s, or how it could be imagined. Some other cinematic depictions of slavery in the musical comedy genre make this even more explicit. Very interesting example, in fact, of this, and from our point of view, I think one of the oddest examples of this is a film from 1955 called Jupiter's Darling, which is a musical comedy, believe it or not, about Hannibal's invasion of Italy, starring the great Howard Keel. And there's one scene in particular in that which makes explicit and actually has a whole song and dance number on the basis of slavery being a desirable state, taking the way in which slavery would be typically represented in, for instance, the Hollywood 50s and 60s blockbuster, The Epic About the Ancient World, as a demonstration of oppression opposed to and aspired for freedom, and turning that idea on its head.
I never knew that slavery could be anything like this.
I didn't buy you for myself. I bought you for her.
I never knew that slavery could be anything like this. If this be slavery, then give me slavery. If this be slavery, I don't want to be free. With your protection and your affection, my lovely lady, I don't want to be free.
Now, in all of these cases, of course, you could say that antiquity is very much being represented through a contemporary filter, whether we're talking about the contemporary period being the early decades of the 20th century, or the post-Risorgimento Italian context, or the decades of fascism, or the post-war decades in the Hollywood context. But I'd like to leave you now with what I actually think is one of the most interesting and potentially one of the most layered examples of how musical comedy can at times explore the ways in which we are constantly reimagining and constantly rearticulating antiquity. And this comes from perhaps an unexpected source, the musical comedy Seven Brides for Seven Brothers from 1954, again, as with Jupiter's Darling, starring the great Howard Keel. Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, which is actually based on a previous stage play, draws upon the story of the rape of the Sabine women, the myth of Romulus leading the early Romans, the early men of the first settlement of Rome, to steal away the women of the Sabines so that they will have wives and can continue the future of their city. An odd choice in terms of a myth to base your musical comedy on, you might think. But interesting enough, in the film itself, that parallel and the translation, so to speak, of the classical story and the classical setting into the contemporary period is explicitly referred to. Because Seven Brides for Seven Brothers isn't set in 1955, it's actually set in the 1880s on the frontier. And here the characters who are involved in this, the brothers themselves, are forming their own community. And they quite explicitly, as you'll see in this final clip, they are specifically drawing upon the text that refers to, in this case they choose, as their primary source, they choose the text of Plutarch that describes the rape of the Sabine women by Romulus and his men, and they convert that through their own understanding, which is very much represented as an 1880s frontiersman interpretation of this story, in order to inform their own action. So here you actually have several layers. You have the ancient narrative, which itself, of course, in the mythic context is already a story that the ancient peoples, the ancient Romans specifically here, were telling. You have the representation of an earlier period, an 1880s translation, understanding of that story, and then you have the 1950s audience looking at these characters from the 1880s, interpreting this ancient myth. So to some extent this actually exposes the way in which there are always multiple layers of understanding and representing the ancient world based on previous representations of representations, and so on, always being viewed and always being interpreted quite explicitly from the contemporary position, from your own subject position. So to end, I give you Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, The Sobbin' Women.
You could just get a look at yourselves. You look like a bunch of lovesick bull calves. If you're so sweet on those girls, why don't you do something about it? Why don't you go marry them?
Oh, sure. Just go marry him. As easy as that.
You know they'd never let us marry him now in 1,000 years.
Well, then do like the Romans did with the Sabine women. Or Sabine women, or whatever they called them. Those Romans were in the same fix you're in. They was opening up new territory, and women were scarce, just like here. And there was these Sabine women down in town. So what'd the Romans do? They went down there and they carried them off. You can't do as good as a bunch of old Romans. You're no brothers of mine. Of course, this being Oregon and God-fearing territory, you'd have to capture Parson along with them.
Hey, them Romans. They're the ones I heard about settled up north of here?
No, this was in olden days. I read about it here in Millie's book.
Oh, book.
Well, this is history. This really happened.
Tell you about them sobbing women who lived in the Roman days. It seems that they all went swimming while their men was off to graze. Well, a Roman troop was riding by and saw them in their me oh my. So they took them all back home to dry. At least that's what Plutarch says. Oh, yes, them women was sobbing, 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 fit to be tied. Every muscle was throbbing, throbbing from that riotous ride. Seems they cried and kissed and cried all over that Roman countryside. So don't forget that when you're taking a bride, sobbing fit to be tied from that riotous ride.
So then what happened?
Gather around, I'll tell you.
They never did return their plunder. The victor gets all the loot. They carried 'em home by thunder to rotundas small but cute. And you never seen, so they tell me, such downright domesticity with a Roman baby on each knee named Claudius and Brute. Oh, yes, them women was sobbing, 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 passing them nights while the Romans was going out hobnobbing, starting up fights.
Is that so?
They kept occupied by sewing lots of little old togas for them tots and saying, someday women folks will have rights.
Passing all of their nights
just sewing
while the Romans had fights.
Hey, listen to this.
Now when the men folk went to fetch 'em, the women would not be fetched.
It seems when the Romans catch 'em, their lady friends stay catched.
Right, now let this be, because it's true, a lesson to the likes of you. Rough 'em up like them their Romans do, or else they'll think you're catched.
Oh yes, them women was sobbing, sobbing, sobbing buckets of tears.
Mighty sad.
On account of old Dobbin, Dobbin really rattled their ears.
And that ain't all. Oh, they acted angry and annoyed.
But secretly they was overjoyed.
You might recall that when corralling your steers.
Oh, 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 the poor little dear.
What do you sit there for? Why don't we go down and get him?
Oh, yes, them women was sobbing, sobbing, sobbing
yes,
women.
Them sobbing women.
Just remember what Robin, Robin, Robin Hood would have done.
Them sobbing women.
We'll be just like them, they're merry men. They all marry once again.
And though they'll be a sobbing for a while.
Oh, yes, we're gonna make them sobbing women.